Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to chair the next session on the latest global sanctions implications for the region. We don't have much time, and I would like to leave at least 5 to 10 minutes at the end of this panel to ask our distinguished panelists questions on the topics that we will be addressing. So moving along, the few agenda points I would like us as a channel to discuss, and before introducing the panel, obviously we have a distinguished panelist from the UN Security Council, expert, that will talk through some of the developments within the UN Security Council recently and the future. So we look forward to that, especially as it relates to terror financing and especially in the region. No sanctions panel will be complete if we don't touch upon Iran and the developments recently with the US withdrawal from the JCPOA. So we'll touch upon that topic as well. And then my personal topic of interest is the difference between implicit and explicit sanctions. Implicit sanctions, what we normally call narrative sanctions, with special reference to something like the OFAC 50% rule and some of the implications that has within sanctions compliance. If time allows, we would talk about rebuilding in conflict zones like Syria and Iraq and the sanctions challenges that brings within the region. And a very interesting topic for me, at least after just meeting briefly with the panelists beforehand, the sanctions risk in transshipment and the live vessel tracking for sanctions compliance. So to help me to address these agenda points, I have first on my right a distinguished guest for whom I've got a great deal of respect, Guy Zubi, a sanctions expert from the UN Security Council, an expert on ISIL Taliban monitoring within that team. I look forward to your contribution from that perspective. Scott Ramsey, Regional Head for Sanctions at HSBC, and Sajid Hussain, Senior Executive Vice President at United Bank. Welcome, guys. So let's jump right into it, Gav. As I said in my opening remarks, from a UN Security Council perspective, broadly, generally, and also very specifically on terror financing, if you can just brief the audience on what you see as recent developments or developments in the past that's important for this region, but very importantly, some future developments that we can see from the UN Security Council.
Thank you, Ernest, and thanks for Refinitiv and everybody who gave me the chance to be among you today in this very important summit, in a very important time, actually. As our teacher, Mr. Mansour, and Hans-Peter mentioned in the morning, we are now witnessing the kind of fall of military capabilities of some of the terrorist groups. But just to address the question, and if we all consider ourselves maybe a second or a third generation of implementers on the ground of the United Nations Security Council sanctions, we can easily note how it evolved from being addressing or calling or encouraging sometimes the governments, the legislative bodies of governments, the regulatory bodies, to nowadays speaking in specific industries and businesses. As we know, the first round of evaluation of the FATF in the region, we're talking about the legal framework and how to set up these kind of mechanisms. But nowadays, we're talking about the effectiveness, where the United Arab Emirates, for example, is up to, inshallah. But this is where the Security Council is trying to shape up the resolutions, where in the phase of we call it the blue line, which is just like cooking the resolution, where we can take the challenges of implementers on the ground, and in this case, financial institutions, and to give it to the drafters of the resolution when they set up in very close sessions to address these kind of challenges and to outline how they're going to implement it on the ground. So previously we were talking about how the assets freeze as the first sanctions before travel ban and arms embargo was the head of the spear of sanctions regimes. But now it was expanded more to maybe include in sometimes the travel or the aviation industry, where a terrorist or a sanctioned individual or entities can easily prevent him from buying tickets within the stage of the travel agencies before hitting to the aviation, and to make the aviation and the flight subject to these kind of risks. But nowadays, the Security Council addresses based on recommendations that we took from these kind of forums like this one, where we can tell the either the permanent 5 members of the Security Council or the 10 elected members all together how the implementer is going to implement before putting more on their shoulders and on their burden to implement. And of course, we in the Security Council community look at banks at the head of the spear in terms of implementing these kind of sanctions, because you are exactly in a position to deal with these kind of either potential or suspicious people or sometimes sanctioned individuals and entities. But like we mentioned yesterday, and a kind of owing you as the ideal implementers of the sanctions, the Security Council nowadays is addressing or focusing more, like we mentioned yesterday, the issue of the relationship between the transnational organized crimes and terrorism financing. And maybe you can focus in one region comparing to other one, but it's impacting all the globe. And in this case, the MENA region is one of these regions where the Security Council will be looking forward to have that. But this is a kind of maybe a heads up for you as financial institutions, where you can address it or amend some kind of tiny adjustment of your systems and your tick sanctions flags or other alerts. But we are working together with the groups like the FCCG and Refinitiv to address these kind of new, let's say, heads up especially for the financial institutions.
Yes, thank you for that heads up, and I think that's a very important topic that you've raised. The interconnectedness that we see in the recent years between terror organizations, individuals involved in terrorism, organized crime, money laundering, etc. The terrorism financing guys needs the expertise of the organized crime people that know how to set up false accounts, that know how to launder the funds and get those proceeds through the system. So a great development, and we look forward to see what that will bring. I just want to leave you on the spot just for one more question before I move on. You being the expert on terror financing and many years of expertise in this, do you see us winning the fight? Do you think the sectors, financial sector, government, businesses are joining to fight financing of terrorism? Can you see any developments from where you're sitting within the UN Security Council expertise?
Thank you. This is a very good question, which gives maybe the colleagues in the room an idea of like, yes, the answer is yes in a one word. And I think like the Security Council latest resolutions addresses a specific kind of industries. These kind of industries, manufacturers of fertilizers in the agricultural field, drone manufacturers, oil produced or hydrocarbon spare parts, etc. So we easily noted that these kind of industries start to figure out that they own data, and this data means that they need to apply the KYC, due diligence, etc. But at the same time, they rely on the Security Council as a kind of advisor in a very early stages to give them a heads up, like this specific group, if it's sanctioned, in the case of ISIL or other cases, may use kind of legitimate businesses. And we have this case nowadays, as you can note the news in Iraq or in Syria, where the organization is in the last stages of its so-called khilafah. But at the same time, they were, according to what we received from intelligence services of member states, they were prepared for this stage, i.e. they were investing in some kind of legitimate businesses. The FATF itself mentioned these kind of things. The MENA FATF also managed to do a kind of a project where any kind of country which has a kind of cases on the terrorism financing, new trends, typologies, and in some cases to mention specific businesses. And I can easily mention the real estate, farms, and others where they use the so-called clean skin to be under the radar screening of any intelligence services. So again, it's yes, but again, these kind of new technologies or new companies, they're eager to, first of all, and we can understand this in a very crystal clear manner, that they want to secure their businesses, their entities, rather than just to want to apply or to be comply with the international standards.
Excellent. And I'm sure the audience will have a number of questions to you on more detail on that topic, but in the interest of time, I would like to move on to the next topic. I know we've, in the past years, at this summit, talked extensively ad nauseum about Iran sanctions, but I think it's back on the table again with the US withdrawal from the agreement and the snapback and all of those sanctions being on the table again. So Scott and Sajid, if I can put you on the spot from a practical perspective within the financial industry, if I can start with you, Scott, what have been the implications? What have you seen happening since that happened a few months ago? What impact did it have on you guys?
Okay, thank you. So I think the first thing is that we've seen a lot of clients who said they were going to do this business somewhere else, have started to pull out. From our perspective as a bank, it kind of feels like we've jumped in a time machine, gone back to 2011, 2012, when we had different sanctions regimes in place. So what that means is this will go from being in the open to being a bit more in the corner. So you've got a lack of transparency, the use of cutouts and intermediaries. So nothing's going to look like what it seems. So for my banking colleagues, it's just really understand that the finance doesn't mirror where the goods go. Those can be two different things. The next we see is the sectorial sanctions coming in place. And the sectorial sanctions really kind of, the best way to describe it is you have a pond of water and someone chucks a big rock in it and all those waves come out there. So it's, this could be material or significant, this may not be. And the idea about those is to create additional pressure. So you need to be wary of those, especially industry-specific ones. And just to add kind of fire to this tinderbox, we see the anti-blocking part coming in from the EU, and what does that really mean? So from our perspective at the moment, that's kind of come into our reps and warranties when we're doing negotiations with companies. It's just trying to balance the legislative framework, so we are meeting both of them at the same time. So for me, that's probably what I've seen the most so far.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you, Ernst. Though we were never back, we actually never went back to BAU on Iran, but this post-November scenario is actually open a can of worms that companies working both with US and EU, how would they balance? And that is the key basically question. And as you all are aware, that there is a special legal vehicle being put in place to do Iran business by EU and UK. So that is how they basically properly ring fence it, and how practical that would be, that working with companies who working with EU companies who are working with, who would basically continue to work with Iran is going to be the biggest challenge for this region especially. and then very close cultural and economic ties, how to manage that, how to manage cross-border trade with Central Asian countries, the basically transit countries. All of that will be a huge challenge for banks and the corporate sector going forward. And that is where the balance needs to take place. And the technology, again, how this, the topic of transshipment and live vessel tracking will come into play, then we will talk more about it. But how to keep yourself away from trouble by being on top of all the transactions that you're doing in terms of where they are originating from and where they are terminating to in its entirety. So that is the most sensitive area in my view that needs to be tackled properly.
Excellent. And we tend to focus quite extensively on Iran and North Korea for good reasons, obviously. But we did see in 2014 the changes with sanctions as it relates to Russia, Ukraine, and the impact that that has had globally. And as Scott, you touched upon sectoral sanctions, which really became a big issue 2014 with Russia, and then end of 2017 with Venezuela. And I think a topic that we've spoken a bit about in the past, but I would like to talk about the practicalities and the impact that this have, especially in this region, is the concept, as I've mentioned in my introductory remarks, of, for a lack of a better word, what we tend to call narrative sanctions or implicit sanctions. So just to define that once again, an implicit sanctions or narrative sanctions is where sanctions apply to an entity that's not listed by name, whether on OFAC, UN Security Council resolutions, or EU, or whatever the case might be. But there's a narrative statement in that sanctions regulation that extends that sanctions to a non-listed entity. And although these rules have been in place, if you look at North Korea, even from 2006, the requirement that you can't do businesses with entities owned or controlled by the government or any sanctioned entity. We've seen this with 2008 with the OFAC 50% rule. We saw this extensively nuanced in 2014 with Russia, and then obviously with Venezuela in 2017, and more specifically this year on Petroleus de Venezuela, quite a global Venezuelan oil company. So, Rajit, if I can Sajid, just turn to you on the practical implications that you see from a practitioner's perspective to comply with this difficult requirement. And Scott, just to get your views on that from where you're sitting, on how do you comply with this requirement?
Yeah, this is one of the most challenging part of sanction compliance, whereby the entity itself is not sanctioned, but it's basically linked to a sanctioned entity or linked to indirectly linked to the sector that is basically sanctioned. So if part of that ecosystem, and to identify and then to basically make it part of your negative list is the foremost action that needs to be taken proactively. In that respect, again, the data is at the key, at the heart of all of this strategy, that to have a data linkages established within your database and with the negative list database, whereby you can find the linkages and especially from the entities who are listed, their principals, associates, and affiliates. They are the ones who are the most difficult to identify. If the entity is basically listed itself only, and their principal, associates, and affiliates are not basically listed, so how to basically figure them out, how to identify those linkages, same addresses, or same ownership structures, or the internationally available databases, whereby the World Check or any other can do those type of adverse media linkages. So these are the tools which can give you that sort of assurance, though it's an ongoing war against these intermediaries and people who are concealing their identity or who are facilitating to bypass this sanction compliance regime.
Scott?
Yeah, so just to add to that, I suppose it just comes down to the basic KYC aspect. You know, if we know who owns it, who are the connected parties, we can start connecting the dots.
Yeah.
Obviously, though, if my name's on the list, I'm going to try and hide it. So the next one comes down to when you said about sectors, is if you've got a high-risk industry, so for example, you know, we can talk about Venezuela and gold, you know, people were probably going away and going, what's my exposure to precious metals? What's my exposure here? What's my exposure to other countries? Am I involved here or not? So you can both go by who are the people, but you can also go, well, what are all the sectors I serve? I may do some enhanced due diligence on these ones.
But you've touched upon an interesting topic with the Venezuelan sanctions, and before traveling to this region, I thought to myself, there should be very little exposure, but talking about the gold industry, I found it interesting to hear what relationships there might be. So any ideas for the audience as what reputational risk it might have for this region and what the impact might be?
So if you think about the situation is that you've got probably a couple of sanctions regimes which don't really kind of lend themselves to this area. You know, I've been here 11 years and it's mostly been Iran, mostly been Syria, mostly been Sudan. But, you know, North Korean typologies exist here. You get people turning up with their North Korean passport, want to do a transaction. You know, those type of things have been seen in this area. You talk about Venezuela, up until probably 2 months ago, wasn't really on my radar. We had processes in place. But the reality is the sanctions are about increasing pressure. So a transaction that was okay a month ago wasn't okay 3 weeks ago. So you've really got to think to yourself, when these type of sectorial sanctions come in, what's my exposure to that country? Where am I involved? And what's my game plan? Is this something that I'm happy to be on the front page of the news? Is this the business that I'm happy to do? So for example, I'm selling humanitarian products to this regime. You know what? You might be happy with that. But if you're saying, okay, I am buying gold from these people, well, sooner or later, that pressure might get ramped up and that may become something bad. If you think about it, when I explain Russian sectorial sanctions, I say you think about Vladimir Putin and all the people around his table, slowly but surely, they start sanctioning all the people around there. So I'm sure the team meetings start becoming, not really talking about the team, but I got sanctioned today. So if you're in those countries or do business with those countries that are faced with sectorial sanctions, you've really got to understand what your exposure is and put that against your risk appetite, because your reputation is key. I remember a former CEO of a company that I was involved with said, oh, what's your latest update on Iran sanctions? And he goes, you know what, we're not looking to increase our business there. From that day on, for the next year, every single correspondent bank asked us what our exposure to Iran was, even though it was zero. He just said the wrong thing, and everyone picks it up. So there is going to be a direct cost of increased due diligence and just the work that goes with it. So you just need to be, is this something that I want to do?
Excellent. And Sajid, if I can just stay on that topic, for me it's fascinating to understand the Venezuelan impact on the region. Do you see from your side, whether it's from the oil industry, any impact, or the gold industry from the past few weeks, months, impacting the region?
Not really, but our guards are on, that if there is any intermediary or there is any masking sort of an activity going on, so we have our guards on and we haven't experienced any as yet.
The one thing that we do see from a content perspective, especially assisting our clients from a Refinitiv side in complying with narrative sanctions and uncovering the spider webs of ownerships and UBO structures, is obviously stating the obvious, just putting out the challenge that we see is that as soon as the sanctions gets issued, we've seen that with Venezuela now, with Petroleus de Venezuela, they within days, in weeks, will change their ownership structures or the percentage of ownership, dropping it just to 49%, quite interesting. These things that one needs to be aware of. Guys, before I get back to you, I just want to mention one interesting development that we've seen recently, and that's Section 228 of the GATSA change that we've seen with regarding Russia and the Russian sanctions. And more specifically, up until a year ago, the concept of implicit sanctions or narrative sanctions has been very much focused on entities owned or controlled by a sanctioned individual or entity. But this recent changes with Russia has expanded that sanctions also to family members, so spouses, children, etc. So a Russian SDN, Ukrainian Russian SDN on the OFAC list, for example, also now extends to those family members without mentioning those names. So it becomes really, really difficult to focus on that. But we're running out of time, and I would love to touch upon the future of the rebuilding of conflict zones like Syria and Iraq and the challenges that we have around that. So, Guy, if I can just turn to you to get your expert opinion, especially from the terrorist financing perspective within that regions and other conflict areas. What do you see as the tension that we have from that perspective, private and public sector involvement, and the future of rebuilding those countries and still staying compliant with the various sanctions regimes?
Thank you again. And I was very happy when I heard this morning my teacher, Mr. Mansour, mentioning the PPP. But maybe unlike other colleague panelists who later on touched upon it, we on the Security Council are kind of advocates for the private sector more than to governments. We encourage member states and their FIUs, law enforcement, etc., to initiate this kind of relationship. Because in the field of financing of terrorism, as we all know, the raw materials of intelligence about who may be suspicious to finance terrorism maybe is not the financial institutions. There is cases where financial institutions and their compliance or the so-called FIUs of the banks itself initiate this kind of investigation, yes. But in terms of ISIL 2.0, which is, I'm afraid to say, I'm a messenger of a bad news. As we all know, militarily it was defeated, but it's now the classic terrorist organization where it went underground, meaning that the head of the spear of the implementation, which is FIs, financial institutions, need to be more vigilant now comparing to 2014, 2016. Having said that, this kind of public-private partnership, in some cases, and I'm fortunate to sit with Middle Eastern countries where they believe that now they need to kind of paving the path towards their FIUs and giving them some kind of heads up where either designated listed individuals or entities might be suspicious. And we have a very, very famous case in this regard, and I'm sure you heard about it, which is an entity has been sanctioned lately, Silsilat al-Dahab, which is a money house exchange or a hawala place, where the Security Council tries to encourage member states to, when you sanction an entity, try to help the implementers by identifying who runs this entity, just to make it easier for them from customers' perspective. But at the same time, like you said, Ernest, now we're gonna witness the flow of money going backwards to Syria, rather than before where ISIL were financing its affiliates outside the conflict zone. So the rebuilding of Syria, the reconstruction of the country now will engage financial institutions where you need, with the government, with law enforcement and the FIUs, be more vigilant in terms of what happened, if you remember before, when this kind of rebuilding money mistakenly in the hands of terrorists in the case of Iraq. So this is where now the Security Council, international community is focusing on this stage now as the group is kind of defeated militarily. But again, it's went underground and we are witnessing more kind of activities around the world, North Africa or in some cases Central Asian countries.
So Scott, in view of the warning lights that Mr. Zubi has touched upon with ISIL going underground, especially in Syria and these countries, in this region, do you see some appetite from the financial industry to, if things should change to the positive within places like Syria, moving into those countries to help with the reconstruction investments?
We are all encouraged to do so and to maybe engage in this kind of good humanitarian efforts. But at the same time, this is maybe not the first time where financial institutions were engaged in rebuilding some kind of conflict zones. But fortunately, the United Nations itself, not just the Security Council, is doing more vigilant and more kind of measures to control these kind of end beneficiary monies. So in a way, I'm not trying to relax you guys, but in a way, you're going to have a kind of a buffer filtering before any transaction goes from your entity to these end beneficiaries of these goods. It has to be vetted, like in many layers. It has to be secured and cleared by many agencies before receiving the money or a kind of contractors, even the personnel of the companies who are going to, in reality, rebuild the country again.
Scott?
Yep, so if you look at it from a banking perspective, it's probably going to be similar in some sense to when the JCPOA was signed. I think a lot of financial institutions will be somewhat reluctant. There's issue of transparency. You've got some of the banks who do this, who say to them, okay, let's do these transactions, but don't mention the word Syria. You see that sometimes coming up. You see aspects of due diligence. A lot of the international banks have been out of that field for quite some time, so you don't actually know who's good and who's not good. And so you kind of see a lot of people just going from a risk appetite perspective, I'm not quite sure on this. However, if you look in the market, you see a lot of companies that want to do this. So I'm sure where there's a will, there's a way. There'll be someone who will step into the breach and facilitate that. But at the moment, I see a lot of the FIs just being reluctant.
Okay.
I agree with Scott that if it is led by multilateral agencies or any UN sort of forum, then financial institutions may be encouraged to participate. Otherwise, directly, bilaterally, it will be a very difficult call at the outset. It has to make a commercial sense as well.
Absolutely.
Apart from the other risks that are there, end user thing and all.
Always the challenge. I definitely want us just to briefly touch upon it because it's extremely interesting. So Scott, if you can just quickly touch upon the transshipment challenges and the interesting examples that you shared beforehand that the audience need to be aware of.
Okay, so when people think transshipment, they're mostly thinking ships. And I think the world spent a good 4 years going, I don't want to do anything with a ship that stops at Iran or Syria or whatever. But if you go back and look at the OFAC regulations, when they talk about stuff which is of Iranian origin, they're not just talking about stuff that's made in Iran, they're talking about things that are land transshipped through Iran. So if you look logically where we are in the Middle East, you look logically where the CIS states are, the boats can't go there, heavy stuff can't be flowing there. The easiest way and the safest way is to transport these items through Iran. And some countries like Turkey share a land border. So what we find is a lot of our clients and a lot of people in the industry just don't really understand the risk of transshipment. So someone in Turkmenistan sends you $1 payment, all it's going to say is invoice this coming to you, but your client could be sending something to Turkmenistan by boat, to Bandar Abbas, by truck, to Turkmenistan. So if you look at the case of American export lines that came out in 2017, OFAC clearly came out and said in that case, which was spare parts transshipped via Afghanistan to Iran, we're going to look at this. Now, if you look at where OFAC is with its enforcement actions, most of the enforcement actions are for things dated 2014, 15, 16. They're a little bit behind. But we're pretty sure that there is a focus on this area, and perhaps it's not that well understood.
And it's very interesting, Sajid, also speaking to you on this topic. You mentioned some interesting examples of vessels meeting in open
Yeah,
ocean and the
ICs.
transshipment challenges around that. That's very interesting. If you can just spend a few seconds on giving us that insight.
Yeah, I mean, in this day and age, post-November, even more so pronounced it has been that in this basically Gulf, that wherever the vessels passing through, and if they are stationary for any point in time in high seas and in close proximity to another vessel, so there is a risk of transshipment from one vessel to another, or from a sanctioned vessel to another vessel, or a Iranian origin goods getting transported on that. So the live tracking of vessels become even more important in this current regime of sanctions. So that is where the banks need to focus. They actually must be focusing on this area. So this was one of the key.
Interesting how important live vessel tracking can also be for sanctions compliance.